My cheating mom falsely accused my dad of everything and ruined his life, both financially and emo. I am Christina, 28 years old, the only child of what was once a happy family. My father James was the kindest, most genuine man I have ever known until my mother Diana drove him to take his own life 10 years ago. Their 20-year marriage ended with false accusations, betrayal, and a devastating financial ruin that destroyed my dad. What my mother never expected was that her lies would eventually catch up to her. Let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever witnessed the devastating power of lies in a family. Growing up in our suburban home in Pennsylvania, I truly believed we were the perfect family. Dad worked as a software engineer at a respected tech company, while Mum taught third grade at the local elementary school. Our house was always filled with laughter, warm meals, and genuine love. My childhood memories are painted with weekend camping trips, board game nights, and Dad teaching me how to ride a bike while Mum cheered from the porch. Dad would often surprise us with spontaneous road trips during summer vacations. We visited the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, and countless beaches along the East Coast. Mum would pack picnic baskets with sandwiches and homemade cookies, and we would spend hours talking about everything and nothing. Those were the days when their eyes would meet across the table, and you could feel the connection between them, something I thought would last forever. Every night at dinner, Dad would ask about our day, genuinely interested in everything Mum and I had to say. He never missed my school recitals or science fairs, even if it meant leaving work early or rescheduling important meetings. Mum would brag to her friends about how devoted he was to our family. "James is 1 in a million," she would say, and everyone agreed. When I turned 16, things began to change. Mum was 42 then, and something shifted in her behaviour. At first the changes were subtle. She started wearing more makeup and bought new clothes that were more stylish and fitted than her usual teacher attire. Her hair, previously always in a practical ponytail, was now professionally coloured and styled. I thought maybe she was just trying something new, perhaps going through what Dad jokingly called her second youth. But then the late nights started. Mum would come home hours after school ended, claiming she had parent conferences, grade-level meetings, or was helping with after-school programs. Dad never questioned her. He trusted her completely and often worked late himself to ensure we had everything we needed. Our family had always lived comfortably, but Dad wanted to start saving more for my college fund, so he took on additional projects. One evening, while Mum was in the shower, her phone kept buzzing with notifications. I glanced over and saw messages from someone saved as T-work. The texts were vague but strangely intimate. "Miss your smile today," and counting hours until tomorrow. I was confused but too young to fully understand the implications. When I casually mentioned to Mom that her phone had been buzzing, she became unusually defensive, quickly checking it and then putting it away in her purse instead of leaving it on the counter as she normally did. A few weeks later, I was at the mall with friends when I spotted Mum at a cafe across from the food court. She was sitting with a man I had never seen before. They weren't doing anything explicit, but there was an unmistakable intimacy in how they leaned toward each other, how his hand occasionally brushed against hers, and how she laughed at whatever he was saying. Something about it made my stomach turn. When Mum saw me standing there, the colour drained from her face. She quickly composed herself and waved me over. "Christina, what a coincidence! This is Thomas, a colleague from school," she explained, her voice slightly higher pitched than normal. Thomas smiled politely and extended his hand, but his eyes seemed calculating as they assessed me. "We are discussing the upcoming school fundraiser," Mum added unnecessarily. Thomas nodded in agreement, but something felt off about the whole situation. There were no papers or planners on their table, just 2 coffee cups and a half-eaten piece of cheesecake with 2 forks. As I walked away, promising to see Mom at home later, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that settled in my chest. That night, I wanted to talk to Dad about what I had seen, but he came home exhausted after a 12-hour workday. Besides, what would I say? That Mum was having coffee with a co-worker, it hardly seemed worth mentioning, even though my instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Instead, I watched as Dad greeted Mum with a kiss on the cheek and asked about her day. She gave vague answers about school matters and quickly changed the subject to an upcoming parent-teacher conference he needed to attend for me. As they talked, I noticed how Mum kept a physical distance between them on the couch, something she had never done before. When Dad reached for her hand, she let him hold it, but there was a stiffness in her posture that hadn't been there before. That night, lying in bed, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Parents have friends and colleagues, and there was nothing explicitly wrong with what I had seen. But deep down I knew. Something had changed in our perfect family, and I was terrified to find out what it might be. By the time I turned 17, the tension in our home was palpable. Dad still acted the same, thoughtful and loving as always, but Mum had become like a stranger living among us. She was physically present but emotionally distant. Family dinners became rare as she frequently claimed to have evening work commitments. Weekends, once sacred family time, were now filled with her errands and activities that somehow never included Dad or me. "I have to help set up the new reading curriculum," she would say, while applying perfume that was definitely not for a meeting with elementary school teachers. "The district needs volunteer teachers for a Saturday workshop," she would explain, while dressing in her nicest clothes, far too formal for any school function I had ever attended. Dad accepted these excuses without question, still believing in the woman he had married 20 years ago. "Your mum works so hard," he would tell me when I expressed frustration at her absence. "Teaching is demanding and she has taken on more responsibilities this year." But I wasn't convinced. The lies were becoming more elaborate and frequent. One Sunday, Mum claimed she needed to meet with the parent committee for the school play. But when I called my friend whose mother was the head of that committee, she confirmed no such meeting existed. That was when I decided to start documenting everything. I kept a journal of when Mum left the house, what reasons she gave, and how long she was gone. I noted changes in her behaviour, like how she would take phone calls in another room speaking in hushed tones, or how she password protected her phone, something she had never done before. One afternoon, I pretended to be sick so I could stay home from school. When Mum left for work, I followed her at a distance. Instead of going to the elementary school, she drove to a coffee shop near the district offices. Thomas was waiting for her. I watched from my car as they greeted each other with a kiss that was definitely not between colleagues. They sat together for nearly an hour, holding hands across the table, before leaving together in his car. I followed them to an apartment complex about 20 minutes from our house. They went inside and I waited in my car, feeling sick to my stomach. 3 hours later, they emerged and Mum straightened her clothes before Thomas kissed her goodbye. He watched her drive away before returning to the building. The expression on his face was one of smug satisfaction that made me want to scream. Over the next few weeks, I gathered more evidence. Mum and Thomas had been seeing each other for over a year based on text messages I managed to glimpse, and the timeline of her behaviour changes. Thomas, I discovered, wasn't just any colleague. He was the principal of Mum's school, recently divorced, and considerably wealthier than my dad, with an expensive car and designer clothes. Meanwhile, Dad was working himself to exhaustion. He had been promoted to senior engineer, which meant more responsibility and longer hours. "Just a few years of this," he would say, "and we will be able to afford your college tuition without loans, plus have a nice nest egg for our retirement." He still brought Mum flowers every Friday, still tried to plan date nights that she increasingly cancelled. The contrast between my parents broke my heart. Dad, devoted and unsuspecting, was sacrificing his time and energy for a future with a woman who was already planning her exit. Mum, calculated and deceptive, was building a new life while enjoying the financial security Dad provided. The most disturbing development was how Mum began to subtly undermine Dad to friends and family. At a neighbourhood barbecue, I overheard her telling her friend Karen, "James is so wrapped up in work these days. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers he has a family." The comment was delivered with a sad smile, positioning her as the neglected wife rather than the cheating spouse. To her sister on the phone, she complained, "He controls all our finances. I have to ask permission to buy anything for myself. It's exhausting." This was an outright lie. Dad had always insisted Mum have equal access to their accounts and frequently encouraged her to treat herself. These subtle character assassinations continued and expanded. Mum started describing Dad as emotionally distant, workaholic, controlling, and occasionally even hinted at him having a temper, something completely contrary to his actual gentle nature. She was creating a narrative I realized with horror. She was laying groundwork. When I finally confronted her, it was after I found a brochure for divorce attorneys hidden in her car. We were alone at home, Dad working late as usual. "Are you having an affair with Principal Thomas?" I asked directly, my voice shaking despite my attempts to stay calm. Mum's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to a calculated composure. "Christina, you are imagining things. Thomas and I are colleagues and friends. Your father has been so absent lately that you are creating fantasies about my life." I saw you with him, I countered. At his apartment. I know you have been seeing him for over a year. For a moment, panic flashed in her eyes before she switched tactics. You have been spying on me, invading my privacy. This is exactly the kind of controlling behavior your father has, and now you are copying him. I was stunned by how quickly she turned the accusation around. Dad is not controlling. He has never been anything but supportive and loving. There are sides to your father you do not see, she said coldly. Our marriage has problems you could not possibly understand. I suggest you focus on your own life and stop trying to ruin this family with your accusations. You are the one ruining this family, I shouted, tears streaming down my face. Mum approached me, then her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. If you say anything to your father, you will destroy this family. Is that what you want? To tear everything apart, because that is what will happen if you cannot mind your own business. I was shocked into silence. This woman, with her cold eyes and manipulative words, was not the mother who had baked cookies for my class and kissed my scrapes when I fell. She was someone else entirely, someone dangerous. Your father would never believe you anyway, she added with confidence. He trusts me completely. That night, I cried myself to sleep, torn between loyalty to my father and fear of what revealing the truth might do to our family. I did not yet understand that Mum had already decided our family's fate, and the worst was yet to come. Spring of my senior year should have been about prom graduation plans and college acceptance letters. Instead, it became the season when my mother destroyed my father with carefully crafted lies. It started with her announcement over dinner one evening, delivered with artificial sadness in her voice. James, Christina, I need to tell you something difficult. Mum said, her eyes downcast in a perfect performance of reluctance. I have been unhappy for a long time, and I think we need to separate. I have already spoken with an attorney. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. His face drained of colour as he stared at Mum in disbelief. Diana, where is this coming from? We can work through whatever problems you are feeling. We can go to counselling. I have tried, James. For years, I have tried to make this work, but I cannot do it anymore, she replied, her voice steady despite the bombshell she had just dropped. I need space to figure out what I want. What followed was a series of increasingly vicious accusations. At first, Mum claimed vague emotional dissatisfaction, saying Dad was distant and uninterested in her life. When Dad desperately tried to understand, pointing out their 20 years of seemingly happy marriage, she escalated. You have controlled me for years, she said during a heated discussion a week later. I had to account for every dollar I spent, ask permission for basic things. Do you know how humiliating that was? Dad looked genuinely confused. Diana, we have always made financial decisions together. You have your own credit cards, access to all accounts. When have I ever controlled your spending? You made me feel guilty for buying anything for myself, she countered, twisting reality. Your disapproving looks, your comments about saving for retirement. It was subtle, but constant control. With each passing day, the accusations grew worse. Mum told her friends and family that Dad had been emotionally abusive for years, that he isolated her from her friends, monitored her calls, and criticised her constantly. None of this was true, but Mum was convincing, especially to people who only saw the public side of their marriage. Your father is very good at hiding his true nature, she told her sister, loud enough for me to hear. He saves his worst behaviour for when we are alone. The most devastating blow came when she started hinting at physical intimidation. She never directly accused Dad of hitting her, which would have been demonstrably false, but she began using phrases like, I never felt safe, or I was always walking on eggshells, afraid of setting him off. These calculated insinuations spread through their social circle like poison. Friends we had known for years began looking at Dad differently. They stopped inviting us to gatherings. Dad's calls went unreturned. At church, people who had once greeted him warmly now gave him a wide berth. I do not understand what is happening, Dad said to me one night, his voice breaking. How can people believe these things about me, 20 years of being a good husband, and suddenly everyone thinks I am some kind of monster? I tried to tell him about Mom's affair, showing him the evidence I had gathered, but he was so shattered by the betrayal that he could barely process it. Even if she has been unfaithful, why the lies? Why try to destroy me like this? He asked, tears streaming down his face. The answer became clear when the divorce proceedings began. Mum had hired one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the county, a shark known for extracting maximum settlements. Later I learned that Thomas had helped pay the retainer, which was more than Dad made in a month. In their initial filing, Mum's attorney painted a picture of a controlling, abusive husband, and a long-suffering wife who had sacrificed her career advancement to support his. They demanded the house, both cars half of Dad's retirement savings, and substantial alimony despite Mum's teaching salary. Dad had to drain his emergency fund to hire an attorney who warned him that the climate in family court often favoured mothers, especially when abuse allegations were involved even without concrete evidence. But there is no evidence because there was no abuse, Dad protested. It does not matter, his attorney explained grimly. In cases like this, perception often overrides reality, and your wife has created a very damaging perception. I tried to testify on Dad's behalf, explaining Mum's affair and her pattern of lies, but Mum's attorney painted me as a daughter manipulated by her father to turn against her mother. The judge largely dismissed my testimony, suggesting I was too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships. Meanwhile, Mum leveraged her position as a beloved elementary school teacher. She had parents from her classes write character references describing her dedication to children and community. She presented herself as a nurturing caregiver who now needed the court's protection from her controlling husband. The school principal, Thomas, kept his distance publicly but provided a glowing professional reference describing Mum as an exceptional teacher who had endured personal hardships with grace. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. As the court dates multiplied, Dad's mental health deteriorated rapidly. He lost weight, developed insomnia, and seemed to age years in a matter of months. The father who had always been my rock, who taught me to ride a bike and helped with my math homework, was crumbling before my eyes. I never thought Diana could do this, he told me one evening. 20 years together and I do not even recognize her anymore. How could I have been so blind? I had no answer for him. I was struggling to recognize my mother as well. This woman who could look a judge in the eye and tearfully describe fear and abuse that never existed, all while destroying the man who had loved her faithfully for 2 decades. The court case dragged on for months, draining Dad's resources and spirit. Each new accusation seemed to cut deeper than the last. Each court appearance left him more defeated. And through it all, Mum maintained her performance as the victim seeking justice, never once acknowledging the devastation she was causing or the lives she was destroying with her lies. The financial collapse came swiftly after the initial court hearings. Dad's company had been patient at first, understanding he was going through a difficult divorce. But as the proceedings dragged on, requiring him to miss work for court appearances and meetings with his attorney, their patience wore thin. "I need you focused on the Westlake project," his manager told him after he missed an important client meeting due to an emergency hearing. "The team cannot keep covering for your absences." Dad promised to do better, working late into the night to catch up on missed work while simultaneously preparing documents for his attorney. The strain was visible in the dark circles under his eyes and his increasingly disheveled appearance. 2 weeks later, he was called into the senior manager's office and informed that the company was going in a different direction. With his termination came the loss of our health insurance and his steady income. The timing could not have been worse, as the court was in the process of determining alimony and asset division. Mum's attorney immediately filed a motion claiming Dad was deliberately becoming unemployed to avoid financial obligations. "He has always been manipulative with money," Mum told the court. "This is just another control tactic." The judge seemed skeptical of Dad's job loss, but did not go so far as to call it intentional. Still, the court calculated his support obligations based on his previous salary rather than his current unemployment, arguing he had the capacity to earn at that level again. The first major asset to go was our family home. The mortgage had been manageable with 2 incomes, impossible with none. The court awarded Mum temporary exclusive use of the house during proceedings, forcing Dad to find alternative housing. He rented a small 1-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex across town, the only place he could afford while bleeding money on legal fees. I had just started my freshman year at the state university, but after Dad's job loss, I knew I could not continue. I withdrew from classes and moved into the apartment with him, taking a job as a barista to help with expenses. Dad objected strongly at first. "Your education comes first, Christina. We will find a way." "There will be time for school later," I insisted. "Right now we need to stick together." The truth was, I was terrified to leave him alone. His depression had deepened with each new setback. Some days he could barely get out of bed, let alone focus on job hunting. Other days he would apply to dozens of positions only to face rejection after rejection. At 48, he was competing with younger engineers, willing to work for less, without the complications of a high-profile divorce. Meanwhile, Mum and Thomas flaunted their relationship with increasing boldness. They no longer bothered hiding their connection, appearing together at school functions and community events. Mum even had the audacity to move Thomas into our family home, the home Dad still technically co-owned and was paying the mortgage on, through automatic withdrawals from his rapidly depleting savings. When I drove by the house to pick up more of my belongings, I saw Thomas's expensive Audi in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see them laughing in the kitchen, where Dad and I had once baked birthday cakes together. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. I spent hours searching for evidence that could help Dad's case, anything, to prove Mum's affair predated her separation claims, or to counter her abuse allegations. I found old photos of family vacations where Mum looked genuinely happy, emails, where she had praised Dad to friends, even a Valentine's card. From just months before she left, where she wrote about her wonderful husband. I compiled everything and gave it to Dad's attorney, who submitted it as evidence of Mum's deception. But the judge seemed unmoved. Marital dissatisfaction often develops gradually, he noted. Previous happiness does not negate current claims. The financial bleeding continued. Dad's retirement savings, meant to support their golden years together, was now being drained for legal fees and basic survival. Each month brought new notices, new demands, new threats of consequences if payments were missed. The lowest point came when Dad received the final alimony determination. Despite his unemployment and rapidly deteriorating finances, he was ordered to pay Mum $2,000 monthly in spousal support plus additional payments toward the mortgage until the house could be sold and assets divided. "How am I supposed to pay this?" he asked, his attorney voice hollow. "I have no income." "You might need to consider bankruptcy," the attorney advised grimly, "though that will not eliminate the support obligation." That night, Dad sat at our small kitchen table staring at the court documents until well past midnight. When I brought him tea, trying to offer some small comfort, he looked up with such despair that I barely recognized him. "I worked my entire adult life to build security," he said quietly. "I wanted to provide for you, for your mother, for our future. And now it is all gone. Worse than gone, it is being used against me." Mum, meanwhile, continued her comfortable life. Her teaching salary, combined with Thomas's principal income and Dad's court-mandated support, meant she wanted for nothing. She bought a new car, took weekend trips with Thomas, and began renovating the kitchen in what was still legally half Dad's house. When Dad fell behind on alimony payments, unable to conjure money from empty accounts, Mum's attorney filed for contempt. The notice arrived threatening jail time if he did not comply with the court order. "She knows I cannot pay," Dad said, his hands shaking as he held the document. "She knows exactly what this is doing to me." I tried contacting Mom directly, pleading with her to be reasonable, to acknowledge Dad's situation and agree to modified payments until he could find work. Her response was chilling. "Your father made his choices," she said coldly. "He chose to be difficult in the divorce, and now he is facing the consequences. If he truly wanted to support his family, he would find a way." The disconnect from reality was staggering. In her mind, Dad was still the villain of her story, deserving of punishment, while she was entitled to maintain her lifestyle at his expense, regardless of whether it destroyed him in the process. As winter settled in, our apartment's heating failed repeatedly. We huddled under blankets, saving every penny for the mounting legal bills and overdue support payments. Dad's job search had yielded nothing but rejection, his once impressive resume now tainted by his employment gap and the visible toll of stress. Each day I watched him fade a little more, the strong, confident father of my childhood replaced by a hollow shell crushed under the weight of injustice he could not fight, and obligations he could not meet. February 17th. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. It was a Tuesday, unusually cold for Pennsylvania. I had worked a double shift at the coffee shop and came home exhausted around 10 p.m. The apartment was dark except for a small lamp in the living room. Dad sat at the kitchen table writing. "You should get some sleep," I told him, noticing the untouched dinner I had left in the refrigerator for him. He looked up with a strange calmness I had not seen in months. "I will soon. How was work?" "The usual." Mrs. Patterson complained about her latte again. I tried for normalcy, pretending not to notice the stack of envelopes neatly arranged beside him, each addressed and stamped. "You are a good daughter, Christina," he said suddenly. "The best anyone could ask for. I want you to know how proud I am of you." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "Dad, is everything okay?" "Just tired," he replied with a faint smile. "Go get some rest. Things will look different in the morning." I hesitated, sensing something was wrong but not knowing what to do. Dad had been depressed for months, but tonight felt different. Still, he shooed me toward my room, promising he would go to bed soon. "I love you, Dad," I said from my doorway. "I love you too, Christina, more than you could ever know." Those were the last words I heard from him. In the morning, I found him gone, and a sealed envelope with my name on it on the kitchen table. Inside was a 10-page letter and his wedding ring. The letter began simply, "My dearest Christina, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please forgive me for what I am about to do, but I can see no other way forward." What followed were pages of love, regret, and explanation. He wrote about his complete financial ruin, the contempt charges pending against him for unpaid support, and his inability to find work. He detailed how he had reached out to old friends for loans, only to be rejected by people who now believed he was an abuser. He described the hopelessness of fighting a system that had already decided he was guilty based on accusations without evidence. "I have nothing left to give me," he wrote. "My savings are gone, my reputation destroyed, my future empty of all but more pain and humiliation. The only thing of value I still possess is a life insurance policy from before the divorce proceedings began." My hands shook violently as I read those words, understanding with horrible clarity what he had done. The policy had been in place for years, intended to provide for Mum and me if anything happened to him. It was one of the few assets not frozen or contested in the divorce, as it was in an irrevocable trust with me as the beneficiary. "This is the only way I can still provide for you," the letter continued. "The only asset Diana cannot touch. Use it wisely, build the life you deserve, and please try not to think too harshly of your mother. Whatever her fault she gave me, and for that alone, I would endure all this pain again." I dropped the letter and ran to the bathroom, retching until there was nothing left but bitter bile. Then I called 911, my voice barely functional as I reported what I feared. They found his car parked at Stillwater Bridge, his coat folded neatly on the passenger seat. 3 days later, they recovered his body downstream. The official cause of death, drowning. The unofficial truth, my father had been systematically destroyed until death seemed his only escape. The funeral was small and sparsely attended. Dad's parents were both deceased, and his only brother lived in Australia and could not make it in time. A few colleagues from his old job came looking uncomfortable and leaving quickly. His attorney attended briefly, offering awkward condolences before hurrying away. Mum did not show up. She sent a modest flower arrangement with a card expressing deep sorrow for this tragedy, as if she had been a distant acquaintance rather than his wife of 20 years and a primary architect of his despair. Later I learned she and Thomas had taken a weekend trip to the Poconos during the funeral, posting smiling photos on social media while I buried my father alone. The life insurance policy paid out $500, $1,000, an amount that once seemed enormous but now felt like blood money. I could not touch it for months, leaving it in a separate account while I moved through the world like a ghost. I deferred my return to college, unable to focus on anything beyond basic survival. In the immediate aftermath, I was numb, functioning on autopilot. I arranged the funeral, cleared out the apartment, put Dad's few remaining possessions in storage. I found another job as a server at a local restaurant, working nights because I could not sleep anyway. It was during those long, quiet nights that my grief began transforming into something harder and more focused. Sorrow crystallized into rage, not just at my mother, but at the entire system that had allowed such injustice. The courts that accepted accusations without evidence. The friends who abandoned Dad without question. The society that automatically cast him as the villain because of his gender. And most of all, the calculating woman who had orchestrated it all, who even now was living comfortably in the home my father had provided, spending the money he had earned, enjoying her new life, while he lay cold in the ground. In those dark hours, a resolve formed within me. Dad might be beyond justice now, but the truth was not. Mum had built her new life on lies, and lies could be exposed. She had destroyed my father through careful manipulation of perception, and perception could be changed. It took me 2 years to be ready, 2 years of processing my grief and formulating a plan, 2 years of watching Mum and Thomas from a distance, learning their routines, their social circles, their vulnerabilities, 2 years of working multiple jobs and saving every penny, because what I planned would require financial independence. Most importantly, I spent those years gathering information about how Mum had systematically constructed her web of lies, identifying who had been most influential in spreading her false narrative, and finding the weak points where truth could break through. By the time I was ready to act, I knew more about my mother's life than she would have ever imagined. I understood her greatest fear, the thing that drove her deception. Diana Wilson could not bear to be seen as anything less than perfect. Her reputation as the devoted teacher, the wronged wife, the brave survivor was everything to her. And that was exactly where I would strike. 2 years after Dad's death, I began implementing the plan I had meticulously crafted during countless sleepless nights. I was 21, hardened by grief, but focused with a clarity that sometimes frightened me. The Christina, who had once dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, was gone, replaced by someone with a single purpose, revealing the truth of abuse that had been buried under my mother's elaborate lies. I started with Dad's former colleagues, the ones who had distanced themselves after Mom's accusations began. I created a dossier for each person containing evidence of Mom's affair with Thomas timeline inconsistencies in her abuse claims and copies of loving cards and emails she had sent Dad during periods she later claimed were filled with fear and mistreatment. Jason Mercer had been Dad's friend for 15 years before cutting contact. I requested a meeting at a quiet cafe, bringing photographs of them together at company picnics, fishing trips, and birthday celebrations. "I thought you should see who my father really was," I said, sliding the photos across the table. "Not the monster my mother described." Jason looked uncomfortable. "Christina, divorce is complicated. There are always two sides." "Yes," I agreed. Truth and lies. I then showed him text messages between Mom and Thomas dating back to before her separation, filing security camera footage from a hotel they had visited while she was still living with Dad, and excerpts from Dad's suicide letter. My father lost everything based on lies. I told him, my voice steady. His reputation, his career, his will to live, the least he deserves now is for the truth to be known. Jason left our meeting visibly shaken. 3 days later, he called to apologize for abandoning Dad. "I should have asked more questions," he admitted. "We all should have." This scene repeated with variations as I methodically contacted everyone who had been important in Dad's life. Some were defensive, others guilt-ridden, a few openly skeptical. But the evidence was compelling, and doubts about Mom's narrative began to spread through their social circles. Parallel to these private conversations, I created an anonymous blog titled The High Cost of Lies. Without naming names initially, I documented how false accusations in divorce proceedings could destroy lives using Dad's story as a case study. I included statistics on suicide rates among men going through contentious divorces, information about how allegations without evidence could nonetheless determine court outcomes and resources for those facing similar situations. The blog gained traction in online communities focused on family court reform. As it grew, I gradually introduced more specific details from our case, always carefully worded to avoid defamation claims, while making the identities increasingly clear to anyone who knew the situation. My most strategic move targeted the professional sphere where Mum and Thomas operated. The school district had strict policies against relationships between supervisors and those under their authority. Their affair had begun while Thomas was Mom's direct superior, a clear violation of professional ethics. I compiled a comprehensive document detailing their relationship timeline, supported by photographs, witness statements from former restaurant servers who remembered them as regular customers, and hotel receipts I had painstakingly obtained. I sent this package anonymously to the superintendent and each school board member with copies to the education reporter at the local newspaper. The investigation was immediate. Thomas was placed on administrative leave while the district examined the evidence of professional misconduct. Mum, while not suspended, found herself under intense scrutiny, especially when questions arose about whether Thomas had used his position to provide favourable evaluations or assignments. During this period, I also focused on exposing the financial aspects of their deception. Through careful research, I documented how Mom had maintained an expensive lifestyle immediately after separation, despite claiming financial hardship in court. Credit card statements showed purchases of designer clothes and jewellery during the same period she was demanding emergency spousal support. I revealed how Thomas had helped fund her aggressive legal strategy, effectively using his resources to destroy my father, while maintaining the appearance that Mum was fighting her battle alone. I highlighted the disparity between the luxurious vacations they took together and the tiny apartment where Dad and I struggled to keep the electricity on. These revelations spread through the community, undermining the carefully constructed image Mum had created. People who had once sympathized with her escape from an abusive marriage began questioning the narrative. Friends who had supported her unconditionally started noticing inconsistencies in her stories. The most damning evidence emerged unexpectedly. Dad's former secretary contacted me after seeing the blog revealing she had inadvertently recorded a phone conversation where Mum had called the office. In it, Mum had laughingly told a friend who was with her about playing the victim card, and how no one questions a woman who says she felt afraid even without proof. The recording was from 6 months before she filed for divorce, contradicting her claim that she had been terrified of Dad's reaction to her leaving. In the background, a male voice, clearly Thomas, could be heard suggesting ways to maximize the settlement. This recording, which I had verified for authenticity, became the centerpiece of my campaign for truth. I sent copies to key people in their professional and social circles, including the judge who had presided over their divorce case. While it could not undo the legal decisions, it shattered any remaining illusions about Mom's credibility. The final phase of my plan involved making all this information public in an undeniable way. I organized a community forum ostensibly about truth and justice in family court, inviting legal experts, mental health professionals, and family advocates to speak. The event was well advertised, and many of Mum and Thomas's colleagues and acquaintances attended out of professional interest. During the panel discussion, I was introduced as a survivor of the system's failures and invited to share my story. In a calm, measured voice, backed by a presentation of evidence that had been carefully reviewed by an attorney to avoid legal repercussions, I told the complete truth about what had happened to my father. I described how Mum's calculated lies had systematically destroyed Dad's reputation, career, and will to live. I detailed the affair with Thomas and their joint efforts to maximize financial gain through false accusations. I explained how the court system had enabled this injustice by accepting allegations without requiring substantiation. Most powerfully, I read excerpts from Dad's suicide letter, his final words revealing the depth of despair caused by a process that had presumed his guilt and stripped him of everything. The room was silent when I finished speaking. In the back, I saw Mum standing with Thomas, her face ashen. She had been invited anonymously, not knowing I would be speaking. As people turned to look at her, some with open hostility, others with confused reassessment, she and Thomas quickly left. The community fallout was immediate and severe. The school board, already investigating the professional misconduct allegations, now faced public pressure to take decisive action. Thomas was terminated for violation of district policies and ethical breaches. Mum was reassigned to an administrative position away from classrooms pending further review. Their social circle contracted dramatically as friends and colleagues distanced themselves, either convinced by the evidence or simply unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The community that had once embraced Mum as a brave survivor now regarded her with suspicion and, in many cases, outright contempt. Within months, they sold the house, my childhood home, and moved to a smaller town about 100 miles away. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Thomas eventually left Mum, unwilling to weather the professional and social consequences that continued to follow them. She was left alone, her reputation in tatters, her carefully constructed life dismantled by the very truth she had tried to bury. As for me, I finally felt ready to move forward. I used part of the insurance money to return to college, switching my major from veterinary medicine to law with a focus on family court reform. The truth had cost me my father, but revealing it had freed me from the consuming anger that had threatened to define my life. I had honored Dad in the only way I could, by ensuring his story was finally heard. Today marks 10 years since my father took his life. I am 28 now, the same age my mother was when she married him. In the decade since that terrible February morning, I have built a life my father would be proud of, though the journey has not been easy. After graduating law school, I joined a non-profit organization dedicated to advocating for fair treatment in family court proceedings. My personal experience gives me a perspective many of my colleagues lack an intimate understanding of how easily the system can be manipulated and the devastating consequences when it fails. I specialize in cases involving false accusations, working to ensure evidence is properly evaluated and both parties receive fair hearings. The law firm I now partner with has established a foundation in my father's name, providing legal assistance to those who cannot afford adequate representation in high-conflict divorces. Professionally, I have found purpose in my pain. Personally, healing came more slowly. For years, I avoided romantic relationships, terrified of vulnerability after witnessing how my father's love had been weaponized against him. Trust did not come easily. Michael changed that. We met at a conference on family law reform where I was speaking. As a family therapist specializing in divorce trauma, he understood my hesitations without taking them personally. He gave me space to process my fears, never pushing, but always steadfastly present. 2 years ago, we married in a small ceremony by the ocean, and last month we welcomed our son, James, named for the grandfather he will never meet, but whose legacy lives on. My mother attempted to contact me several times over the years. The first few messages came shortly after she and Thomas moved away, angry accusations about how I had destroyed her life. Later, as years passed, the tone shifted to requests for reconciliation, claims of remorse, suggestions that we heal together. I never responded. Some actions create wounds too deep for conventional healing, breaking trust in ways that cannot be repaired. My silence was not about punishment, but protection, maintaining the boundaries necessary for my own well-being. From occasional updates through distant connections, I know she lives alone now in an apartment in Ohio. Thomas left her within a year of their relocation, unwilling to bear the consequences of actions that had seemed consequence-free during their affair. She works as a tutor, unable to secure another teaching position after the scandal followed her across state lines. Her comfortable life built on my father's destruction has crumbled entirely. The reputation she valued above all else lies in ruins. The relationship she sacrificed my father for proved as false as the accusations she made against him. The security she sought through deception has eluded her completely. And yes, there is a part of me, a human part, I do not deny, that feels satisfaction in this justice. Not happiness in her suffering, but vindication that truth eventually prevailed, even if too late for my father to witness it. My journey toward healing began with rage, but could not remain there. Sustaining anger requires enormous energy, consuming resources better directed toward building rather than burning. Gradually, I learned to channel that fire into productive change, advocating for reforms that might prevent others from experiencing what my father endured. I found unexpected allies along the way. Dad's former colleagues, once they understood the truth, became supporters of the foundation. Several judges who reviewed our materials acknowledged the systemic weaknesses that enable false accusations to carry devastating weight. Even some of Mum's former friends reached out offering testimonials about inconsistencies they had noticed but ignored. The blog I started has evolved into a respected resource for those navigating high-conflict divorces, emphasizing evidence-based approaches and ethical advocacy. It attracts thousands of visitors monthly, many finding hope in knowing they are not alone in their experiences. Learning to live with what happened has been my life's work. Some days are harder than others. Father's Day, the anniversary of Dad's death. Moments when my son makes a gesture that reminds me of the grandfather he resembles but will never know. But I have also reclaimed joy. In my marriage to a man whose integrity reminds me daily that good people exist. In my work helping others find the justice my father was denied. In the simple pleasure of watching my son discover the world with the same curious eyes I remember from childhood photos of myself. The greatest lesson I have learned is that truth, however painful, provides the only solid foundation for healing. Lies create unstable ground, constantly shifting beneath our feet, requiring ever more elaborate constructions to maintain. Truth, even difficult truth, allows us to build something real and lasting. I no longer waste energy hating my mother. Understanding the profound damage she caused does not require carrying the weight of hatred. I have come to see her actions as reflections of her own brokenness, her inability to value honesty over image, substance over appearance. The consequences she now faces were not created by my revelations, but by her own choices. True freedom came when I realized that forgiving is not about absolving the wrongdoer, but liberating yourself. I do not forgive my mother for her sake. She has never shown genuine remorse that would warrant such consideration. I forgive for my own peace to release myself from the prison of bitterness that threatened to define my life after Dad's death. The story of what happened to my father will always be part of me, but it is no longer all of me. I honor him not by remaining trapped in grief, but by creating the kind of life he would have wanted for me, by being the kind of person he raised me to be, truthful and compassionate, even in the face of injustice. If you have ever been touched by false accusations or know someone fighting to be believed, please share your experiences in the comments below. Like this video if you believe in the power of truth to ultimately prevail, and subscribe for more stories about finding healing after betrayal. The road is never easy, but you do not have to walk it alone. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength when we use them to create positive change.